The dust of the auction yard clung to Elias Thorne's worn coat, a bitter powder that mirrored the grit in his soul. He stood apart, a sentinel of sorrow, his face carved from the same unyielding granite as the mountains that clawed at the pale sky. Years had passed since Martha was laid to rest, but the silence in his cabin still screamed her absence. He'd come to town for seed and salt, not for human chattel, yet here he was, drawn by a knot of cruel curiosity and a deeper, unacknowledged ache. On a makeshift dais, a woman, Sarah, stood with 5 small children huddled against her skirts like frightened quail. Her eyes, pools of exhausted despair, were fixed on some distant point beyond the leering faces of the townsfolk and the auctioneer's booming voice. He was Jedediah Crow, her deceased husband's brother, a man whose heart was as barren as his failed farmlands, selling off his brother's leavings to settle imagined debts. A strong back, this woman, though she comes with burdens, Crow sneered, gesturing to the children. 5 mouths, yes, but 5 pairs of hands in time. What am I bid for this, family? Laughter, sharp and mean, rippled through the crowd. Elias felt a cold fury clench his gut. He saw not burdens, but fragments of a shattered life, glinting with a resilience that shamed the sun. The eldest, a boy perhaps 9 years of age, tried to stand taller, his small hands fisted, a miniature guardian amidst the ruins. A girl, younger, clutched a faceless rag doll, her lip trembling. The 3 smallest were blurs of tangled hair and wide, terrified eyes. Sarah said nothing, her silence a wall against the indignity. Elias knew that silence. It was the language of deep wounds. He thought of his empty fields, the quiet hum of the wind his only companion. He thought of the cradle Martha had joyfully sanded smooth, now gathering dust in the attic. A reckless impulse, born of loneliness and a sudden, fierce protectiveness, seized him. Before he could reason it away, his voice, rusty from disuse, cut through the mockery. $50. A hush fell. Heads turned. Crow's eyes, small and avaricious, gleamed. 50 from Elias Thorne. A man who knows value, even if it's buried deep. Do I hear 60? Silence. The townsfolk looked from Elias's grim face to the woman and her brood. They saw a fool, burdened by his own grief, taking on more. Elias saw, he wasn't sure what he saw, but it pulled at something deep within him, a cord long thought severed. Sold. Crow slammed his gavel. To Elias Thorne, for $50, the widow Sarah Jessup and her 5 offspring. The words, brutal and transactional, hung in the air. Sarah's gaze flickered towards Elias, a brief, unreadable glance, before returning to the dust at her feet. He paid the sum, the coins heavy in his hand, a chilling echo of a dowry for a bride long gone. Crow smirked, counting the money. They're all yours, Thorne. Bedding and what few rags they own are in that wagon. He gestured to a dilapidated cart. Elias merely nodded, his face impassive. He walked towards Sarah and the children. The crowd parted, whispering. He stopped before them. The children shrank further. Sarah's chin lifted a fraction, a spark of defiance in her otherwise surrendered posture. He didn't speak. Words were clumsy tools for what needed to be conveyed. He simply turned and walked towards his own sturdy buckboard, expecting them to follow. There was a pause, a breath held by the entire town, then the rustle of worn fabric, the shuffle of small, hesitant feet. The journey from the raw wound of the auction to the isolation of Elias Thorne's homestead was a passage through varying shades of silence. The children, crammed in the back of the buckboard amidst sacks of feed and the few pitiful bundles that constituted their worldly possessions, were as mute as stones. Fear was a palpable presence, a cold mist that emanated from their small bodies. Sarah sat beside Elias on the hard wooden seat, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on the ever-receding town, a place that had offered her nothing but scorn and the ultimate degradation. Elias, too, was silent, his attention on the rutted track, his mind a turmoil of unspoken thoughts. What had he done? He, who had sought solitude as a balm for his grief, had now invited a whirlwind of need and sorrow into his meticulously ordered life. The vast, indifferent landscape mirrored his internal state, rugged, lonely, beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. The wind whispered through the tall pines, a mournful song that seemed to echo the unspoken grief that filled the wagon. Occasionally, a small whimper would escape one of the younger children, quickly shushed by an older sibling. Elias felt their terror, a knot in his own chest. He remembered his own childhood fear, a distant memory but still potent. He kept his expression neutral, his hand steady on the reins. He offered no false comfort, no easy words. His grief had taught him the hollowness of such gestures. Instead, he focused on the practical. When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, he pulled the wagon off the track into a small clearing. He built a fire, his movements economical and precise. Sarah watched him, her eyes narrowed, wary. He produced a loaf of bread and a hunk of cheese from his bag, dividing it into 7 portions. He handed a piece to Sarah first, then to each child, starting with the eldest boy, Thomas. Their small hands snatched the food, their hunger overriding their fear for a moment. He ate his own portion slowly, observing them. The firelight flickered across their faces, revealing dirt smudges, tear tracks, and an exhaustion that went bone deep. The youngest, a girl barely 3, began to cry softly, a desolate sound. Sarah pulled her onto her lap, murmuring something too low for Elias to hear, her hand stroking the child's matted hair. It was the first sign of maternal softness he had seen from her, a crack in her frozen demeanor. He unrolled a spare blanket from his bedroll and, without a word, draped it over the children huddled together for warmth. It was a rough, woolen thing, smelling of horse and pine, but it was something. Sarah's eyes met his for a fleeting second, a flicker of surprise, perhaps, before she looked away. He understood. Trust was not a seed to be planted in such barren soil. If it grew at all, it would be a slow, tenacious vine, seeking purchase in the smallest cracks of kindness. As darkness enveloped them, the sounds of the wilderness pressed in, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Elias lay on the far side of the fire, his gaze on the star-dusted sky. He felt the weight of their presence, a responsibility he had not sought but now bore. He thought of Martha, her gentle hands, her laughter that used to fill the silence. This was not what he had envisioned for his life. But as he listened to the soft breathing of the sleeping children, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred within him, not happiness, not yet, but a sense of purpose, fragile and unexpected, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen earth. The silence of the homestead was different from the silence of the journey. It was deeper, more profound, amplified by the vast emptiness of the surrounding wilderness. Elias Thorne's cabin, nestled in a valley carved by an ancient river, was a solitary sentinel against the encroaching forest. It was sturdy, built with his own hands, but inside, the lingering scent of Martha, of wood smoke and dried herbs, was a constant, bittersweet ache. For Sarah and her children, it was another world, stark and intimidating. The first few days were a dance of cautious avoidance. Sarah moved like a ghost through the small cabin, her footsteps barely making a sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. She kept the children close, their voices hushed whispers. Elias gave them space. He rose before dawn, tending to his few livestock, a milk cow, a handful of chickens, his stoic gelding, Buck. He worked his land, mending fences, clearing new ground, the familiar rhythm of labor a solace to his troubled mind. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were direct, functional. There's water in the barrel. Firewood in the shed, or the cow needs milking. If you're able, Sarah was more than able. She had a quiet competence, a resilience honed by hardship. She milked the cow with practiced hands, her movements gentle, coaxing. She found Martha's abandoned garden overgrown but still holding the promise of life, and began, tentatively at first, then with increasing determination, to weed and tend it. The children, after their initial paralysis of fear, began to venture out, drawn by the irresistible curiosity of youth. Thomas, the eldest, shadowed Elias at a distance, watching him work, his young face a mask of solemn observation. The middle girls, Mary and Eliza, discovered the creek that ran near the cabin, their subdued laughter like the tentative notes of a forgotten melody. little Samuel, a boy of 5, and tiny Lily, the youngest, stayed close to their mother, their eyes still wide with a lingering apprehension. Elias watched them all, his gaze steady, unreadable. He saw Sarah's hands, chapped and work-worn, kneading dough for bread, mending the children's tattered clothes, her touch surprisingly gentle as she wiped a smudge from Lily's cheek. He saw the fierce, protective love in her eyes when she looked at her children, a love that had clearly weathered storms far greater than any he could imagine. He left food on the table, fresh milk, eggs, a portion of whatever he cooked for himself. He did not join them for meals initially, retreating to his small workshop or the porch, giving them the illusion of privacy in the cramped space. He knew they were hungry, not just for food, but for safety, for a place where the sharp edges of the world would not cut them so deeply. One evening, he returned from the forest, a string of rabbits over his shoulder. He found Sarah stirring a pot over the hearth, a fragrant steam rising from it. The children were gathered around the table, a rough-hewn plank he had fashioned years ago. For the first time, there was a semblance of domesticity in the cabin, a fragile warmth that pushed back against the encroaching shadows. He skinned and cleaned the rabbits outside, then brought the meat in, placing it on the counter without a word. Sarah glanced at him, a brief acknowledgement, then turned back to her pot. Later, when the stew was ready, rich with wild vegetables she had foraged, she ladled it into bowls. There were 7 bowls on the table. She looked at him, a silent question in her eyes. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled up a stool and sat down. The children watched him, their spoons poised. The silence was thick, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of uncertainty, of a new, unspoken understanding beginning to take root. He took a bite of the stew. It was simple, nourishing, and more flavorful than anything he had eaten in years. He met Sarah's gaze across the table. For the first time, he saw not just an outcast, but a woman of quiet strength, a mother fighting for her children in a world that had shown them no kindness. And in her eyes, he thought he saw a flicker of something new as well, not trust, not yet, but a dawning awareness that perhaps, just perhaps, this silent, grieving man was not another monster to be feared. The valley air, usually crisp and clean, carried a chill that had little to do with the approaching autumn. Elias felt it when he rode into the small settlement that passed for a town, a cluster of rough buildings huddled by the river crossing. Heads turned, conversation ceased, eyes followed him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The news of his purchase had spread like wildfire, fanned by the malicious gossip of men like Jedediah Crow. He ignored them, his face a mask of indifference, as he bartered for supplies, flour, salt, a length of sturdy cloth. Old Man Hemlock, the storekeeper, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and disapproval, counted out his change with deliberate slowness. "Heard you took on quite a handful, Thorn," Hemlock said, his voice raspy. "A widow and 5 young uns." "Got your work cut out for you," Elias merely nodded, his gaze steady. "Some say Crow got the better of you." $50 for a worn-out woman and a pack of strays. The words were meant to sting, to provoke. Elias felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the old anger, the old grief. But he also felt something new, a protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. "They're not strays, Hemlock," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're family." The word hung in the air, unexpected, definitive. Hemlock blinked, taken aback. Elias gathered his supplies and left, the storekeeper's surprised expression a small, satisfying victory. Back at the homestead, life continued its slow, unfolding rhythm. A small crisis arose when young Samuel, exploring too far, slipped and gashed his knee on a sharp rock by the creek. His screams brought Sarah running, her face pale with alarm. Elias, who had been splitting wood nearby, reached them almost as quickly. Samuel was howling, blood welling from the wound. Sarah knelt, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to assess the damage. Elias, without a word, gently pushed her aside. He examined the cut, his touch surprisingly deft for such large, calloused hands. "It's clean, but deep," he said. "Need stitching." Sarah's eyes widened with fear. I don't know." How he looked at her. I do. He carried Samuel back to the cabin, the boy's cries now subsiding into whimpers against his broad shoulder. Sarah followed, her anxiety a palpable presence. Elias cleaned the wound with boiled water and a clean rag. He found Martha's old sewing kit, the needles still sharp, the thread strong. His hands, usually employed in rough farm labor, moved with a surprising delicacy as he stitched the boy's skin, his brow furrowed in concentration. Samuel, brave despite his fear, clenched his small fists but made no sound, his eyes fixed on Elias's face. Sarah watched, her breath held, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. When it was done, Elias bandaged the wound with a strip of clean cloth. He looked at Samuel, a rare softening in his eyes. "You're a brave lad." Samuel managed a watery smile. Elias then looked at Sarah. Her face was etched with a mixture of relief and something else, gratitude, perhaps. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first time she had thanked him directly for anything. He merely nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Later that evening, as the children slept, Sarah sat by the hearth, mending a tear in Thomas's shirt. Elias sat across from her, sharpening his axe, the rhythmic rasp of stone against steel a counterpoint to the crackling fire. The silence between them was less strained, filled with the shared experience of Samuel's accident. Your son, he is strong," Elias said, breaking the quiet. Sarah looked up, surprised. "He takes after his father in that," she said softly, then a shadow crossed her face. "His father, he was a good man," before, she trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Elias did not press. He knew about loss, about the before and after that cleaved a life in two. He simply continued sharpening his axe, the steady rhythm a comforting presence in the small cabin. He was beginning to understand that this woman, sold and scorned, possessed an inner fortitude that few could claim. She was not just a survivor, she was a protector, a nurturer, her love for her children the unwavering compass that guided her through the darkest storms. And as he watched her, her head bent over her mending, the firelight casting a warm glow on her weary face, he felt a grudging respect, and something akin to a thaw around his own frozen heart. The days shortened, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. A tentative peace had settled over Elias Thorne's homestead, fragile as a frost flower, yet undeniably present. The children's laughter, once a rarity, now echoed more frequently through the valley. Thomas, no longer shadowing Elias from a distance, had begun to help with small chores, his initial wariness replaced by a grudging admiration for the quiet, capable man. Mary and Eliza, their shyness slowly receding, would sometimes present Sarah or Elias with small treasures found on their explorations, a vibrant autumn leaf, a uniquely shaped stone, a handful of late-season berries. Even little Lily, who had clung to her mother like a limpet, occasionally offered Elias a shy smile, her eyes, so like her mother's, losing some of their haunted look. Sarah herself was changing. The drawn, haunted expression was slowly being replaced by a quiet composure. She spoke more freely now, not often, but her words, when they came, were thoughtful, her voice gaining a gentle strength. She and Elias had fallen into a rhythm of shared labor, a partnership forged in necessity and unspoken understanding. He would chop wood, she would stack it. He would hunt, she would prepare the game. They moved around each other in the confines of the small cabin with an increasing awareness, a subtle dance of mutual reliance. One crisp afternoon, Elias returned from checking his trap lines to find Sarah teaching Thomas to read. She sat on the porch step, a worn, leather-bound Bible open on her lap, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep. Thomas sat beside her, his brow furrowed in concentration as he sounded out the words. Elias paused, unseen, watching them. The sight stirred something deep within him, a memory of Martha teaching him his letters, her patient voice, her gentle hand guiding his. He had not thought of that in years. He made a sound, clearing his throat, and they both looked up. Sarah's cheeks colored slightly, as if caught in some private act. "He has a quick mind," she said, her voice soft. Elias nodded. "Good. A man needs to read." He went inside, but the image stayed with him, Sarah, her face illuminated by the afternoon sun, sharing the gift of knowledge with her son. Later that week, he was in his small workshop, mending a piece of tack, when Mary and Eliza approached, hand in hand, their faces serious. Mary, the bolder of the two, held out a small, crudely carved wooden bird. We made this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For you." Elias took the bird. It was rough, misshapen, but undeniably crafted with care. He turned it over in his large hands. "It's a fine bird," he said, his voice gruff with an unfamiliar emotion. A wide smile spread across Mary's face. Eliza ducked her head, shy but pleased. He placed the small carving on a shelf above his workbench, alongside his tools, a small, bright spot of color in the otherwise utilitarian space. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a bridge built across the chasm of their separate griefs. The foreshadowing of a larger threat, however, was never far away. Jedediah Crow had been seen lurking around the perimeter of Elias's property, his resentful eyes like those of a carrion bird. And the whispers in town continued, fueled by malice and misunderstanding. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against the cabin, Elias found Sarah staring out the window, her expression troubled. "What is it?" he asked. She turned, her eyes dark with worry. "I saw him today," she said. "Crow." He was watching from the trees. A cold anger settled in Elias's gut. "He has no business here," he said. "He said he'd be back for Thomas," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "He said a boy that age should be working, earning his keep, not learning letters." Elias's jaw tightened. He looked at Thomas, who was sitting by the fire, absorbed in the Bible Sarah had given him. The boy's face was alight with the joy of discovery. "Crow will not take him," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "He will not take any of them. This is their home now." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw not just a protector, but a man of unshakable resolve. A small measure of peace settled over her, though the fear still lingered at the edges. She knew the world was cruel and men like Crow were relentless. But for the first time in a long time, she felt she was not facing that cruelty alone. The uneasy peace was shattered by the arrival of winter, not the gentle, snow-dusted kind, but a brutal, iron-fisted assault that locked the valley in its icy grip. The wind howled like a banshee, driving snow horizontally, piling drifts chest-high against the cabin walls. For days, they were prisoners, the world outside a blinding white maelstrom. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a small bastion of warmth against the relentless cold. Food supplies, carefully husbanded, began to dwindle. The children, cooped up and restless, grew fretful. Sarah, ever resourceful, organized games, told stories, her voice a soothing balm against their rising anxiety. Elias ventured out only when absolutely necessary, to feed the livestock huddled in the small barn and to gather more firewood. Each trip was a battle against the elements, leaving him breathless and coated in ice. One morning, little Lily woke with a fever, her small body burning, her breathing shallow and ragged. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Sarah's carefully constructed composure. She bathed Lily's forehead with cool water, her hands trembling, her prayers silent and desperate. Elias watched, his own helplessness a leaden weight in his chest. He knew the signs, he had seen them before, with Martha, in that last, terrible winter. The nearest doctor was a day's ride away, an impossible journey in this blizzard. He felt a familiar despair begin to close in, the old grief threatening to engulf him. He saw the terror in Sarah's eyes, the same terror he had felt when Martha's life had slipped away. He had been powerless then, and he felt powerless now. The storm raged on, a relentless siege. Lily's condition worsened. Her coughs were racking, painful. Sarah rarely left her side, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and unshed tears. The other children were subdued, their usual boisterousness replaced by a frightened hush. Thomas sat by his little sister, holding her hand, his young face etched with worry. One evening, as the wind shrieked its fury, Sarah looked up at Elias, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "We need to do something," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She's slipping away." Elias looked at the small, frail child, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt a surge of anger, at the storm, at his own inadequacy, at a God who would allow such suffering. Then, he looked at Sarah, at her unwavering love, a refusal to give up. He remembered Martha's faith, her quiet strength even in the face of her own mortality. He stood up, his decision made. "I'll go for the doctor," he said, his voice firm. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning hope. "But the storm, it's impossible, I have to try," he said simply. He began to prepare, pulling on his heaviest coat, his fur-lined hat, his thickest gloves. He checked his rifle, stuffed extra rations into his saddlebags. Sarah watched him, her heart a mixture of terror and gratitude. Before he left, he knelt by Lily's makeshift bed. He touched her hot forehead, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle. "Hold on, little one," he murmured. "Hold on." He looked at Sarah, his gaze intense. "Keep her warm. Keep talking to her. Don't let her give up." Then, he turned and stepped out into the raging blizzard, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving Sarah and the children to face the terrifying unknown. The wind tore at Elias like a physical blow, stinging his exposed skin with ice crystals, stealing his breath. Visibility was near zero, the world a swirling vortex of white. Buck, his sturdy gelding, struggled through the deep snow, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Elias leaned low over the horse's neck, trying to shield his face, his body aching with the cold. Doubt gnawed at him. Was this a fool's errand? Would he die out here, leaving Sarah and the children to an even worse fate? But the image of Lily's small, feverish face, the desperation in Sarah's eyes, spurred him on. He thought of Martha, her last whispered words, "Live, Elias. Live for both of us." He had merely existed since her death, a hollow shell of a man. Now, for the first time, he felt a fierce, desperate will to live, not just for himself, but for this new, fragile family that had somehow taken root in the barren soil of his heart. Hours passed, an eternity of cold and struggle. He lost the track several times, disoriented by the blinding snow. Once, Buck stumbled, throwing him into a deep drift. He lay there for a moment, the snow quickly covering him, a strange, seductive warmth seeping into his frozen limbs. It would be so easy to give in, to let the cold take him. But then he heard Lily's faint, ragged breathing in his mind, saw Sarah's courageous face. He fought his way back to his feet, his limbs heavy, his resolve hardening into an unbreakable core of determination. Back in the cabin, Sarah fought her own battle. She kept the fire roaring, using their precious wood sparingly but effectively. She talked to Lily constantly, her voice a low, soothing murmur, telling her stories, singing snatches of old lullabies, praying with a fervor she hadn't known she possessed. The other children huddled around the hearth, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on their mother and their ailing sister. Thomas, with a maturity beyond his years, helped keep the fire stoked, his small face grim with responsibility. Mary and Eliza tried to comfort Lily, stroking her hair, whispering words of encouragement. Even little Samuel seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his usual mischievousness replaced by a quiet concern. As night fell, the storm seemed to intensify, the cabin groaning under the weight of the wind and snow. Lily's breathing grew fainter, her small body terrifyingly still. Sarah felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. She had lost so much already, her husband, her home, her dignity. Was she to lose her child as well? She bowed her head, tears finally streaming down her face, not tears of surrender, but of a mother's unbearable anguish. "Please," she whispered to the raging storm, to the unseeing heavens, to any power that might be listening. "Please, not her. Not my Lily." And then, through the howl of the wind, she heard it, a faint sound, a shout, almost swallowed by the storm. She lifted her head, her heart pounding. Was it her imagination? Or? She rushed to the window, wiping away the condensation. Through a momentary lull in the swirling snow, she saw a figure, a man on horseback, struggling towards the cabin. Elias! And behind him, another figure, slighter, bundled against the cold. The doctor! A sob of relief escaped her. He had made it. He had brought help. The door burst open, and Elias stumbled in, covered in snow, his face raw from the wind, but his eyes blazing with a triumphant light. Behind him, Dr. Armitage, a small, wiry man with a determined look, quickly shed his snow-covered outer layers. "Let me see the child," he said, his voice brisk. Sarah led him to Lily. The doctor examined her quickly, his touch gentle but efficient. He listened to her chest, took her pulse, his expression grave. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by Lily's shallow breathing and the roar of the storm outside. Finally, Dr. Armitage straightened up. He looked at Sarah, then at Elias. "Pneumonia," he said. "Severe. But she's a fighter." "And you?" He nodded at Elias. "You got here just in time." Another few hours, he didn't finish the sentence. He opened his bag, taking out vials and instruments. For the next few hours, the cabin became a makeshift infirmary. Dr. Armitage worked tirelessly, aided by Sarah, who followed his instructions with a desperate focus. Elias, exhausted but unwilling to rest, kept the fire going, boiled water, his presence a steady, reassuring anchor in the chaos. He watched Sarah, her face illuminated by the lamplight, her movements precise and gentle as she ministered to her daughter. He saw not a worn-out woman, as Crow had called her, but a tower of strength, a fierce lioness protecting her cub. And in that moment, something shifted within him, a profound realization. This was more than responsibility, more than protection. This was love. A quiet, unexpected love, as resilient and tenacious as the wildflowers that bloomed in the harshest mountain soil. As dawn approached, the storm began to abate. The wind softened its howl, the snow tapered off. And inside the cabin, Lily's breathing deepened, became more regular. A faint touch of color returned to her cheeks. Dr. Armitage listened to her chest again, then smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "The fever's breaking," he said. "She's going to make it." Sarah sank onto a stool, tears of relief streaming down her face. Elias put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that spoke volumes. She leaned into his touch, her exhaustion and gratitude overwhelming. He had risked his life for her child, for their family. He had faced the storm and won. He had done what her own husband, in his weakness and despair, had never been able to do. He had fought for them. The doctor, seeing their shared emotion, quietly busied himself packing his bag. "Elias," he said, his voice softer now. "What you did tonight. Few men would have attempted it. You're a remarkable man." Elias merely shook his head, his gaze still on Sarah and Lily. His actions had spoken for him, louder than any words. The act that truly made the town weep, however, was yet to fully unfold, though its seeds were sown in the heart of that terrible storm. The immediate aftermath of the blizzard was one of slow recovery. Lily, though still weak, was clearly on the mend, her small hand often reaching for Sarah's or, surprisingly, for Elias's rough finger. Dr. Armitage, after ensuring Lily was stable and leaving careful instructions and medication, prepared to depart as soon as a path could be cleared. Elias, though bone-weary, insisted on accompanying him part of the way, to ensure his safe passage through the still treacherous snow. Before leaving, Dr. Armitage took Sarah aside. "Your girl is strong." But it was her mother's strength and Mr. Thorne's courage that truly saved her. He paused, then added, his voice tinged with admiration, "That man, Elias Thorne, is not what folks in town say he is. He's more. Much more." Sarah nodded, her heart full. She knew. When Elias returned, the thaw had truly begun, both outside and within the cabin. The sun, brilliant on the fresh snow, streamed through the small window, painting the interior with light. The children, relieved and joyful, were cautiously playing, their voices a welcome sound after the oppressive silence of fear. Sarah was humming softly as she prepared a thin broth for Lily. Elias entered, stamping snow from his boots, and the domestic scene struck him with a force that took his breath away. This was not his empty cabin anymore. It was a home, filled with life, with warmth, with the messy, beautiful chaos of a family. He looked at Sarah, her face softened by relief and a new, gentle light in her eyes when she looked at him. He saw the children, their earlier fear of him replaced by a tentative trust, even affection. Little Samuel ran to him, tugging on his trousers, babbling about a snow fort Thomas was planning. A small, almost forgotten smile touched Elias's lips. The next time Elias went to town for supplies, several weeks later, the story of his desperate ride through the blizzard had preceded him. Dr. Armitage, it seemed, was not a man to keep silent about acts of uncommon bravery. There was a different tenor to the way people looked at him now. The disdain was still there in some eyes, particularly those of Jedediah Crow and his cronies, but it was mingled with a grudging respect, even awe. Old Man Hemlock, when Elias entered the mercantile, actually nodded a greeting. "Heard about your ride, Thorn," he said, his voice less raspy than usual. "And about the little girl." Glad she pulled through. Elias merely nodded, but he felt a shift. The town was watching. Then came the day of the spring thaw, when the river, swollen with melted snow, threatened to flood the lower valley. A call went out for volunteers to reinforce the levees. Elias, without hesitation, joined the men from town. He worked tirelessly, side by side with men who had previously scorned him, his strength and quiet determination earning their respect. Sarah, hearing of the danger, organized the older children. They baked bread, made stew, and carried it down to the exhausted workers. The sight of this woman, whom they had dismissed as an outcast, and her polite, helpful children, working for the good of the community, began to chip away at the town's prejudice. But it was what Elias did next, an act of quiet, profound generosity, that finally broke through the last vestiges of their hardened hearts. Jedediah Crow, his own farm failing, his bitterness festering, had been spreading increasingly vicious rumors about Sarah, trying to stir up trouble, perhaps hoping to reclaim Thomas as a laborer, or even to drive the family out so he could lay some claim to Elias's improving property. He confronted Elias publicly in the town square, his voice loud and accusatory, spewing venom about Sarah's past, questioning the legitimacy of her children, demanding Elias cast her out. The townsfolk gathered, expecting a confrontation, perhaps even violence. Elias stood silent, his face unreadable, as Crow ranted. Sarah, who had come to town with Elias, stood beside him, her head held high, though her hands trembled. The children, sensing the tension, huddled close. When Crow finally paused for breath, Elias spoke, his voice low but carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "This woman," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before resting on Sarah with an undeniable tenderness, "is Sarah Thorn." My wife. A collective gasp went through the crowd. He reached out and took Sarah's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Her eyes widened, then filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming emotion. "These children," Elias continued, his voice ringing with conviction, "are my children. They bear my name. This is my family." He then turned to Crow, his eyes like chips of ice. "And any man who speaks ill of them, speaks ill of me. Any man who threatens them, threatens me." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he did something no one expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He opened it and poured a small pile of coins onto Hemlock's store counter. "This," he announced, "is to settle any and all debts, real or imagined, that Jedediah Crow claims against the estate of Sarah's late husband. It is more than generous. And it is the last he will ever receive from us." He then turned back to the stunned townsfolk. "My wife and I, and our children, we are part of this valley now. We will contribute, we will share, we will build. But we will not be judged, and we will not be broken." He looked at Sarah, a rare, gentle smile gracing his lips. "Let's go home, Sarah." He led her and the children through the silent, astonished crowd. It was then that the weeping began. First, a few women, moved by the quiet dignity of Sarah, by the fierce protectiveness of Elias, by the undeniable love that bound this unlikely family together. Then, some of the men, their faces grim, perhaps with shame at their own past judgments, perhaps with admiration for Elias's bold declaration. Old Man Hemlock was seen wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Even some of Crow's former supporters looked away, their bluster gone. They had witnessed not just a defense, but an anointing, a public claiming and consecration of a family forged in hardship and sealed with unwavering love. Elias Thorn had not just bought a family at auction, he had redeemed them, and in doing so, had offered the town a glimpse of its own capacity for redemption. The tears that fell that day were tears of recognition, of shame, of hope, and ultimately, of a shared humanity that had been buried too long beneath layers of prejudice and fear. The town had cried, not in sorrow, but in a profound, cathartic awakening. The years that followed were etched with the quiet rhythm of seasons, each one deepening the roots of the Thorne family in the valley's soil. The cabin, once a haven of solitary grief, expanded, room by room, built by Elias's hands with Thomas, now a strong young man, working proudly by his side. Laughter, genuine and unfettered, became the homestead's most common sound. Sarah, no longer the silent, haunted woman of the auction block, blossomed. Her quiet strength became a gentle authority, her wisdom sought by other women in the valley. Her garden flourished, a vibrant testament to her nurturing touch, its bounty often shared with neighbors. The lines of worry on her face had softened, replaced by the serene confidence of a woman loved and respected. Her marriage to Elias, though born of desperation and circumstance, had deepened into a profound partnership, a testament to a love that spoke more in shared glances and quiet acts of service than in grand pronouncements. Their days were filled with the simple, profound beauty of a life lived with purpose and connection. Elias, his own grief finally laid to rest, found a joy he never thought possible in the boisterous presence of his children. He taught Thomas the ways of the land, the satisfaction of honest labor, the integrity of a life lived in harmony with nature. He walked Mary and Eliza down the aisle, his heart swelling with a father's pride when they married good, hard-working men from the valley. He bounced their children, his grandchildren, on his knee, his gruff exterior melting away to reveal the tender heart beneath. Little Samuel, no longer so little, grew into a thoughtful young man with his mother's kind eyes and Elias's quiet resolve, showing a keen interest in Dr. Armitage's books and healing arts. And Lily, the child who had brushed against death's door, became the sunshine of the family, her laughter infectious, her spirit resilient, a living symbol of their shared triumph over adversity. The town, too, had changed. The initial tears of that day in the square had washed away much of the old prejudice. Elias Thorne's act of claiming Sarah and her children, his unwavering defense of them, had become a local legend, a story told around hearths on cold winter nights, a reminder of the power of courage and compassion. The Thornes were no longer outcasts, they were respected members of the community, their contributions valued, their presence welcomed. Jedediah Crow had long since faded into obscurity, his bitterness a lonely, barren field. Elias and Sarah never spoke of the auction, nor of the hardships that had forged their unlikely bond. There was no need. Their life together was a testament to their journey, a quiet melody of love and resilience played out against the backdrop of the majestic mountains. They found their acceptance not by changing who they were, but by living their truth with unwavering dignity. Their small unit, once an island of perceived shame, had become a beacon, demonstrating that family was not solely defined by blood, but by the unbreakable ties of love, loyalty, and shared experience. One crisp autumn evening, years later, Elias and Sarah sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues. Their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter echoing the sounds Elias had once only dreamed of hearing again in his silent home. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining with familiar comfort. "It's a good life, Elias," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet contentment. He looked out over the land, his land, their land, a legacy of hard work and enduring love. He thought of the desperate man he had been, the broken woman he had bought, the frightened children he had taken in. He thought of the journey, the storms weathered, the battles fought, both external and internal. "Yes, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is a good life." Their love was not a fiery passion, but a deep, steady flame, a quiet, enduring legacy that had not only saved them but had, in its own way, helped to heal a small corner of a cruel world. And as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, their light, like the Thornes' love, was a quiet promise of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to find solace, build family, and cultivate beauty even in the most unpromising of soils. This story, of a struggling widower and the family he unexpectedly claimed, reminds us that the greatest treasures are often found in the most unlikely places, and that acts of kindness, however small they may seem, can ripple outwards, changing not just individual lives, but but the heart of an entire community. It teaches us that true strength lies not in judgment, but in compassion, and that love, in its purest form, has the power to heal, to redeem, and to leave a legacy that echoes through generations. If their journey from despair to belonging, their quiet testament to the power of chosen family, has touched your heart, please share their story so that others too may find inspiration in the enduring strength of the human spirit. Like this telling, and subscribe for more tales that explore the depths of human connection and the quiet miracles that unfold when we open our hearts to one another.